Member for Melbourne.
Ask on another matter. Is there contained in these amendments a definition of a journalist? What counts as a journalist under these amendments?
Just repeat that.
Member for Melbourne.
My question to the Minister was, what is the definition of a journalist? Is there something in these amendments that defines what a journalist is?
Is an English word, and it describes an occupation, a very important occupation. It is not defined in the Act, and I think assuming it was ever controversial, perhaps someday a court could look at it, but I don't think the reference, of course, is a journalist working his profession in a professional capacity as a journalist. So I think it's very well understood, and I don't anticipate there being any problems arising. But some issues of interpretation of words do arise, even when you try to define them elaborately. So I think it's a very well understood term.
Give the call to the member for Melbourne.
Deputy Speaker, well, I wonder in that respect whether it includes a blogger, because we have heard on several occasions from this government, including from the Minister, the transformative role of the internet in journalism. And in many respects I agree with the Minister. So it raises the question. So there are now many people who are performing activities as they would say as journalists, or similar to the functions that used to be carried out by a journalist, but they may not be in the employ of a media organisation. They may be doing freelance work. It might be that they are in the employ of someone else, but that someone else hasn't been traditionally considered to be a media organisation. So a very real question will arise now, because although historically we might know what a journalist was, and yes, it is an English word. I hope most of the words in this set of amendments are English words. But yes, it has been clear historically what a journalist is. But there is now a very real question in the context of a bill that is about what happens on the internet, and in the context of a bill that is about surveillance of metadata. Surely it's something that ought to have been considered in that context, whether people who act and do things online in the form of being bloggers and the likes, whether they count as journalists. And that's certainly something that's been agitated more broadly, and it's certainly something that's been raised by journalists amongst others. So I don't think it is at all fanciful to ask the question about whether someone who is publishing solely online, solely in the form of a blog, and who might not be in the employ of someone else, whether they count as a journalist. And I wonder whether that has been given any thought in the preparation of this, or whether it's perhaps referable to, whether being a journalist is referable to being a member of the MEAA, for example. So I asked the Minister to explain, with respect to bloggers in particular, will bloggers be counted as journalists for the purposes of this? Or, alternatively, because if they're not, then what that means is apparent. The full force of this legislation applies to a blogger. And to a blogger, they will be someone who would be conducting most of their activity, and would argue in many respects most of their journalism. They would be doing that online. They would be doing that online. And so a blogger is certainly someone who wants to, in the same way as a journalist would, to maintain the security and the privacy of their communications with others. They're in fact less likely to be the ones who, in a similar vein to the member of Denison referred to, who you have a phone call and they get picked up and they get communicated perhaps by old means. They are much more likely to be conducting their activities online, and as such to be caught within the remit of this legislation. So for them, it's probably even more important that they be covered. And given that these amendments have been moved, apparently with some significant thought and preparation, even though we haven't had the courtesy of seeing them in this parliament and being able to consider them for any extended period of time, surely this question about online-only journalism ought to have been considered. And it's something that has been raised in the public debate. So if the Minister is going to respond that, well, some of these issues have been canvassed publicly over several years, and so surely we're in a position to move on, well, this This is something that has been published in, has been canvassed in years gone by, and especially canvassed online. So, ask the Minister the simple question: does a blogger count as a journalist?
The Minister.
Well, the answer is that many journalists blog. In fact, I would say probably most journalists blog nowadays, and if they are doing it in their professional capacity, then they are covered by these protections. That's quite clear.
Member for Melbourne.
Well, then, following on from that, with respect to if this amendment means that a blogger is counted if they're doing it in their professional capacity, does that then mean that that blogger has to be drawing a salary in order to do that? Does that mean that they have to be in the employ of someone else? Does that mean for a blogger to count as a journalist, they have to be a member of a registered organisation? What if the person who is the blogger has a number of other capacities that they operate in and not just as a journalist? What, given the Minister's answer, and given that at the end of the day, some very, very serious consequences hang on this, namely whether or not your activity online and who you speak to or don't speak to is going to be kept for 2 years, which might be of great significance to someone who is an investigative journalist who does it in the course of being a blogger. There ought to now at least be some clarity as to whether or not that person, if the Minister's answer is that if you're doing it in your professional capacity as a blogger, you count as a journalist, then can we have some clarity about what counts as a professional capacity? So let's give some examples. Someone who's in the employ of another organisation, are they acting in their professional capacity? Someone who is not in the employ of another organisation but this is their sole means of staying alive, are they acting in a professional capacity? Someone who does it not because they're getting paid but because they believe in what they are doing, is that someone who is doing it in their professional capacity? Do you, as the Minister suggests, have to be otherwise employed as a journalist and someone who blogs? Or can you be someone who's not separately a journalist in the employ of The Guardian or in the employ of Fairfax or so on, who blogs only, who only blogs? Will that count? Because, and I repeat the point for the Minister, this is quite serious because this goes to whether or not that person has the capacity to know that all of their activity, which they're going to be conducting online, counts as private or not. Some very, very important questions hang on this. And so, given the reference from the Minister to the point...
The debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order number 43 and the debate may resume at a later hour. I'll call the Minister for Communications on a...
If I could just seek the Speaker's, the House's indulgence, Mr Speaker, I just ask for an indication from the honourable member for Melbourne whether he proposes to keep speculating about the definition of journalist for a lengthy period, because we could, if we were to give this bill precedence over the 90-second statements, we could deal with this bill before question time. But if the honourable member wants to keep talking about the definition of journalists in order to, for another half an hour or so, then we can allow 90 seconds. So it's really a question of whether the honourable member wants to run down the clock or not. That's
and I'll
the
ask
issue.
the Melbourne. I'll call the honourable member for Melbourne.
Or perhaps I can hear an answer from the Minister and we'll take it from there.
Well, no. I think I'll have to proceed with the 90-second statement. Sorry. Yeah, no, I'm not sorry. I'm governed by standing orders.